In this first video of the nervous system, I'd like to present an overall picture of the system so that we can take that picture apart and deal with the little pieces of it over the next series of videos. The nervous system would look something like this, I suppose, but that's not how it starts out. The nervous system starts out embryonically as a thing called a neural tube. The reason I want to mention that right at the outset is because it is hollow, and we often forget the hollow nature of it. And in an upcoming video, when we deal with the reflex arc, I'll have a diagram which shows us the narrow opening, I suppose we have to call it, the lumen, which is the hollow tube, the middle of the hollow tube here. So in an embryo, the neural tube starts out just as a tube, and then as the embryo develops, the anterior end of it begins to bulge. So it actually forms three bulges like this. And these become things that are known as like the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. There's really 5 regions if you think about it. If this one is the first one, there's a second one where it's not bulging, a third one, a fourth one, and a fifth one. These continue to bulge and develop until we wind up with something that more resembles that. This last part here, where the fifth bulge, or the third bulge with the fifth part, this part is called the brain stem, where it meets the rest of the spinal cord. So what we have, quite simply, is the brain, which is this part at the top, and this part, which I've represented in brown, as the spinal cord. So we have the spinal cord and the brain. And these bulges or lobes of the brain, these are what's become of those initial bulges like that. The surface of the brain isn't smooth. You can see all sorts of lines that I've drawn here, but they're actually crevices, and that gives me an opportunity to mention what gyri and sulci are. Gyrus and sulcus. The crevices, the depressions, the creases in are the sulci. The gyri are the ridges in between. And I'll mention that again in just a few minutes. So we have this first part of the brain. We're not going to go into what the brain parts are. That's a second video. But we have an obvious large part of the brain up here. This is still part of the brain. It's actually the cerebellum, which is in charge of balance and coordination. The spinal cord here. The brain stem right here. Now we'll mention the importance of the brain stem coming up. The brain central nervous system is very delicate, and it has to be protected. We know that the brain itself is protected by bone, the cranium. So right underneath the skin, there's the cranium, which protects the brain, cranium. The spinal cord is protected by vertebrae, which are also bone. So we have vertebrae which go around the spinal cord. And in between the vertebrae and coming out of the brain are nerves. What we've got represented here, the brain plus the spinal cord, brain plus spinal cord, is equal to the central nervous system. Well, in addition to the central nervous system, there's the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral? Peripheral is a word, if you think of perimeter, it means around. So peripheral nervous system is that component of the nervous system that goes around the body. And so there's a whole pile of cranial nerves, 12 to be exact, that come out of the brain and go to do certain things in the body. We've mentioned one already, it's the vagus nerve. We said the vagus nerve, we mentioned that in a much earlier video. That's cranial nerve number 10. Well, if there's 12 of them, I can tell you the very first one, the most anterior part of your body, is the olfactory nerve. That's in charge of the sense of smell. The second one, cranial nerve number 2, is the optic nerve, goes from the eye into the brain, the visual association area of the brain. Cranial nerve number 5 is the trigeminal nerve, which innervates most of the face, so the number 5 deals with this, and so on around there. So there's a total of 12 cranial nerves. I'll put it over here. No, I should put it here. It's peripheral nervous system. There's 12 cranial pairs of nerves, because they're all paired. You have 2 eyes, we're bilaterally symmetrical, and there's 31 spinal nerves. And they come out in various regions along here. So a spinal nerve that would come out from this part of the body, which is a thoracic region, it would be a thoracic nerve. Cervical region up here, cervical. So we have the cervical, which corresponds to the neck region, thoracic, the lumbar, which is the small of the back, that corresponds to this region in here, and the sacral region is the lowest region here, and the coccyx, which is the last little bit there. There are 8 spinal nerves that come from the cervical, the neck region. There are 12 in the chest part. There are 5 there and 6 there. Okay, so this adds up to the 31 spinal nerves. So we have a peripheral nervous system, which is made up of all of these spinal nerves and the cranial nerves and the branches of all those nerves, which go all over the body, hence the word peripheral. And we have a central nervous system, which is just the brain and the spinal cord. In upcoming videos, we have to look at the structure of the brain and what it does. We'll have to look at how the spinal cord is, what it looks like, so where these spinal nerves go in and out, so we can look at the topic of reflexes. We have to look at how nerve impulses are transmitted along a nerve, along a neuron, and within a nerve. We have to actually look at the structure of nerves themselves. When we talk about a nerve, we're talking about a cluster of neurons, which are nerve cells. We have to look at how nerve impulses are transmitted from a nerve cell to an organ, or from a nerve cell to another nerve cell. We will look at the fight-flight response and all sorts of things like that. Before we do, and before we leave this video, I do want to return to the idea of the protection that this delicate tissue has against bone. It's protected by a set of 3 membranes called the meninges. So if I can represent this as being nerve tissue, the spinal cord or brain or whatever, so if this is the nerve, there's actually 3 layers of membrane which are between the nerve and the bone. And the same 3 layers exist between the brain and the cranium as between the spinal cord and the vertebrae themselves. The innermost of these is called the dura mater, the pia mater, sorry, pia mater. The dura mater is the outermost, the one that's adjacent to the bone. And the one in the middle doesn't have the same kind of naming. This means the durable cover. This is the more delicate cover. A mater is Latin for mother, so you get the idea that it's protecting it so that you get those two layers. But the one in the middle is called the arachnoid layer. And if you remember about spiders, arachnoid refers to spider, and it's called the arachnoid layer because it has finger-like projections which go into the various things. In between the arachnoid layer and the pia mater, in here, is a thing called the arachnoid space. And it's in this layer that blood vessels travel to feed the nerve tissue itself. So it's very delicate, protected by the dura mater, arachnoid layer, pia mater, which make up the meninges. And you may have heard of meningitis. Meningitis is inflammation of the meninges. So if the meninges became inflamed, what it does, it puts pressure on the nerve tissue. It's not going to affect the bone too much, but if these things become inflamed and swollen, then the nerve tissue gets compressed, and that can be very, very painful. Now, we've mentioned the central nervous system, we mentioned the peripheral nervous system, which is made up of those things. Have to just mention two other things which we call systems. We've got the CNS, which is the brain and spinal cord. We've got the PNS, which is made up of all these kinds of nerves. But within the PNS, we have an ANS, which is an autonomic nervous system. Autonomic, sort of like automatic, where you don't have to think about it. I mean, your body detects changes within itself. So your body knows when it's supposed to conduct peristalsis along the digestive tube, for example. So the autonomic system is that kind of system where you don't have any real control over it. You can't control the rate at which your stomach is churning food. Obviously, there's two parts to this. One is going to speed it up and one will slow it down, because there may be times when you need more action and times when you need less action. So that's the autonomic system, which is another whole video. And we also have the somatic nervous system. And the somatic nervous system is that part of the peripheral nervous system which we can control. So these two are actually subdivisions of the PNS. Oops, I should have done that. The ANS and the SNS are parts of the PNS. So if we're going to control our muscle action by will, so we want to move our arm, then we're sending a message from the motor area of our brain through a peripheral nerve to the muscle in our bicep to make our arm move. So that's the somatic nervous system. This system doesn't follow the same pattern as a typical system, because we think of a system as being made up of a bunch of organs, and each organ's made up of a bunch of tissues and so on like that. And this one isn't the same. It has that same relationship, but it's not so obvious, I suppose is the way to say it. The whole thing is the nervous system. Within that system, we talk about subcomponents, but the central nervous system, we'd have to consider the brain as an organ. And there are parts within that organ. We'd have to consider the spinal cord as an organ. Outside of that, we have system, organs, tissues. In the nervous system, we have nerve tissue, I suppose, but we have nerves, and then we have neurons. These aren't the same thing. These things are nerve cells. These are made up of nerve cells. So a nerve is made up of neurons. I think that sets the stage well enough for the upcoming videos. Thank you very much.